One Ford spent around $600 million and still sent buyers straight to Holden. Another was meant to be Holden's modern future, but became one of its most damaging disasters. And one won Wheels Car of the Year, sold roughly 18,000 units, and still helped end an entire Australian manufacturing operation. These are not cars that failed quietly. They arrived with big money, big ambition, and big expectations, then collapsed in ways nobody could ignore. Welcome to the 15 most disappointing Australian cars ever made. The name alone should have been a warning. Chrysler by Chrysler sounds less like a car and more like a legal disclaimer written at 4 in the morning by a committee that had already given up. This was Chrysler Australia's attempt to fight the Ford Fairlane and Holden Statesman in the premium large car segment. Sensible ambition, catastrophic branding. Underneath sat a stretched, Valiant platform that was competent enough, with the Hemi 6 providing adequate performance for the class. But competent and adequate are not words that sell premium cars, and the Chrysler by Chrysler never looked meaningfully different from the standard Valiants it was supposed to leave behind. When your flagship is regularly mistaken for a stretched version of your standard model, you have a positioning problem. When nobody particularly cares either way, you have a Chrysler by Chrysler. The Toyota Lexon is proof that badge engineering can go wrong even when the donor car is genuinely excellent. Holden's Commodore was a strong, well-regarded Australian car. Toyota's rebadged version, assembled under the button plan arrangement, somehow turned that strength into an embarrassing admission rather than a product anyone was particularly excited about. It arrived without the manual gearbox options and V8 availability that made the Commodore actually compelling. Fleet buyers who wanted a Toyota badge on their Commodore could have one, they just couldn't have the bits that made people want a Commodore. It was the Commodore minus the reasons to choose it. Badly outsold by its own donor model, the Lexon faded as quietly as it arrived, an experiment in automotive logic so circular it practically came back around and surprised itself. And that was only the badge engineering embarrassment. Next up, a Nissan so forgettable it helped kill local production, and a Holden engine that became a punchline. The Nissan Pintara U12 had one job: be a respectable, locally built Nissan that kept the brand relevant during the critical button plan era. What it delivered was a car so thoroughly, comprehensively average that its sales figures read like an apology note written in pencil by someone who had already quietly left the building. Bland styling, unremarkable dynamics, and a cabin that generated precisely zero enthusiasm made the Pintara an easy car to ignore, which Australian buyers did with considerable consistency. It occupied that most dangerous automotive territory, not bad enough to provoke outrage, not interesting enough to provoke interest. The Pintara's failure helped push Nissan out of Australian manufacturing entirely, a car so forgettable that its primary historical significance was achieved entirely by accident. The Holden UC Sunbird was supposed to be Holden's sensible, fuel-efficient answer to the 1970s energy crisis, a compact four-cylinder for the economy-conscious Australian buyer. A noble idea. Then they installed the Starfire 1.9-litre engine, and noble became something considerably less flattering. Go Auto describes the Starfire as a monumental disappointment, phrasing normally reserved for geopolitical events rather than powertrains. It was weak, unrefined, and so thoroughly underwhelming that drivers had to work it far harder than any fuel-efficient engine should ever be worked, defeating the entire point of buying one. The UC Sunbird arrived as Holden's answer to fuel economy and left as a cautionary tale about what happens when the solution is demonstrably worse than the problem it was designed to solve. A weak Holden four-cylinder was bad enough, but next Ford launches a Falcon with serious problems, and Chrysler builds a car that practically fights itself. The Ford EA Falcon was supposed to open a new era, modern platform, significant investment, new styling, arriving precisely in time to fight the incoming VN Commodore. Ford built a brand new future, then apparently they accidentally shipped the past inside some of the engine blocks. Contaminated foundry sand in the casting process accelerated internal engine wear from the moment the first key was turned. The launch also brought no V8, an aged 3-speed automatic, and quality concerns that followed the EA through its entire production run. First impressions in the large car segment are almost impossible to recover from, and the EA made a memorable one. The AU Falcon receives most of the historical criticism, but the EA Series 1 was where the trouble started, a car that arrived for a fight without its full equipment. The Chrysler Centura had genuine potential, an Australian-developed medium car with Hemi 6 power competing in a segment that was ready for exactly that kind of product. Then the engineering decisions arrived, and interesting became increasingly difficult to locate. The nose-heavy weight distribution produced handling that critics compared generously to a bull in a trotting gig. Then there were the French-built bodies that spent months sitting on salt-laden docks during industrial action, arriving at Australian dealerships already composting themselves from the outside in. Every single Centura sold was a gamble before the buyer had driven a single kilometer. Delays, critical reception, and weak sales turned the Centura into another chapter in Chrysler Australia's long history of genuinely promising ideas executed just badly enough to matter. A broken launch, a bad reputation, and a Chrysler disaster, and we are still nowhere near the worst. The next two cost their makers far more. The Ford XK Falcon was supposed to be Ford's decisive answer to the dominant Holden, an entirely new car, arriving with serious investment and expectations. It also arrived with American front suspension that had never met an Australian road, and Australian roads were not interested in being introduced gently. Front-end failures, premature tire wear, and instability on corrugated surfaces made early ownership a recurring negotiation between driver and vehicle. Ford's response was extraordinary. They blamed the drivers. Imagine buying a brand new Falcon, experiencing front suspension deterioration, and being told the fault was yours. Ford pioneered a customer service philosophy that day which remains unique in its audacity. The Falcon name would go on to become one of the most celebrated in Australian automotive history. The XK was the chapter that nearly stopped the story before it could properly begin. There is a particular kind of disappointment reserved for cars that fail at the worst possible moment. The Holden Cruze was assembled in Adelaide, and it was supposed to prove that Australian manufacturing could compete in the small car segment. A genuinely important argument to be making in 2011 when the case for local production needed all the help it could get. Oil leaks, electrical faults that resisted diagnosis, 1.4-liter turbo water pump failures causing catastrophic overheating, and a recall and reliability narrative that generated headlines for all the wrong reasons produced a result that nobody needed. At one point, the RAC publicly warned consumers away from locally built Holdens. That sentence should not exist, but it does. The Cruze needed to be a success story. It was not, and Australian manufacturing had one fewer compelling argument because of it. The Cruze needed to prove Holden could still build world-class small cars. Instead, it became another warning sign, and next, Toyota's big Australian gamble falls flat. Toyota's reputation for reliability is one of the most powerful forces in the automotive industry, and the Avalon arrived in Australia in 2000, carrying all of it, along with styling that looked on launch day as though it had been designed approximately 4 years earlier and approved by someone who had stopped paying attention. Toyota projected 2,000 sales a month. By 2004, the Avalon was averaging 486. Not a shortfall, but the mathematical equivalent of preparing a banquet and having 3 people show up. Commodore and Falcon buyers had deep, multi-generational brand loyalty, and the Avalon never found a compelling answer to why they should abandon it. The reliability was genuinely there. the excitement was not. In the large car segment, it turned out that excitement mattered considerably more than Toyota had budgeted for. The Holden Adventra was, in principle, a smart idea, arriving at roughly the right moment. A Commodore-based all-wheel drive wagon, positioned just before the SUV wave fully broke over the Australian market. Then somebody decided to launch it exclusively with a V8 engine, and Smart became considerably more specific. Limiting the Adventra to V8 only at launch removed every buyer who wanted all-wheel drive practicality without the accompanying fuel bill, which was a substantial portion of the people who might have bought one. V6 arrived eventually, but by then the Ford Territory had appeared and answered the family AWD question in a way that felt more considered and more accessible. The Adventra had the bones to be genuinely successful. The execution turned a broad market opportunity into a niche product, and the market filed the paperwork accordingly. Now we reach the serious failures. The next 5 did not just disappoint buyers, they damaged brands, embarrassed executives, and helped end factories. Ford Australia built the Capri convertible at Broadmeadows specifically to conquer the American sports car market and announce Australian manufacturing to the world. It was an ambitious project. Then it started raining in Victoria and the roof leaked and the announcement became more complicated. The soft top fabric split in service, water pooled in the floor pans, rusting cars that hadn't completed their first year, scuttle shake, torque steer on the turbo, and a base engine producing 80 horsepower made the package feel underdeveloped. The Mazda MX-5 arrived simultaneously, cost less, and did everything better, which was not ideal timing. The Capri was supposed to put Australian manufacturing on the international stage. It put it in the same sentence as a Japanese competitor that made it look disorganized, and that is a harder thing to recover from than a roof leak. Ford spent approximately $600 million developing the AU Falcon. Go Auto described the result as an instant disaster, a sentence that, given the investment, still produces a physical response in former Ford executives. The styling divided opinion in the sense that most people were firmly on one side. Holden reportedly produced a training video using the AU's looks as motivation for their sales force. Ford's president issued a public apology and rushed cosmetic changes through by 1999. The engineering was actually sound. It was just extremely well hidden beneath styling that sent buyers directly to the VT Commodore showroom. The AU proved, at extraordinary expense, that in Australia styling is not cosmetic. It is structural, and $600 million is not enough to save a car that has already lost the argument at the curb. Only 3 cars left. One came too late to save Mitsubishi, another wrecked Holden's reputation for years, and one won Car of the Year before helping kill an entire factory. The 380 occupies a spot on this list that sits uncomfortably close to genuine sympathy. It was, by most accounts, a perfectly decent large sedan, competent, well-finished, and a real improvement over what preceded it. Decent, however, is not a business plan. A Mitsubishi needed this car to be considerably more than decent. It launched with a 3.8-liter V6 at the precise moment fuel prices were spiking, and government fleets, historically Mitsubishi's most significant buyer group, mandated a shift to 4-cylinder vehicles. The segment timing was wrong. The engine range was wrong. The marketing budget, courtesy of a globally struggling parent company, was essentially a rumor. It sold just 20,000 units across 3 years and marked the end of Mitsubishi's 30-year Australian manufacturing history, a decent car that became, unavoidably and heartbreakingly, an inadequate one. The Holden Camira arrived as the future. Front-wheel drive, European-influenced engineering, Holden's bold declaration that it could compete at world level. The expectation was enormous. Then, almost immediately, the piston rings started failing, and the future started looking considerably less certain. Brand new Camiras consumed oil at rates that would concern a racing team. The body sealant around the firewall shrank, admitting water that rotted floors on cars still under warranty. The gearbox threw itself out of gear without much provocation. Crankshaft failures arrived for owners who had been given no particular reason to expect them. Multiple publications named it one of the worst cars ever built, anywhere by anyone. The Camira's failure was not just mechanical, it was reputational, and reputational damage accumulates interest. Holden spent years rebuilding trust that the Camira burned down in months. The Leyland P76 is the disappointment against which all others are measured. It won Wheels Car of the Year in 1973, sold 18,000 units across 2 years, and delivered the financial blow that closed the Zetland plant and ended Leyland's Australian manufacturing dream. Developed in 16 panicked months on an inadequate budget, it showed immediately. Window seals leaked, carpets detached, head gaskets failed, V8s overheated, wiper motors were not rated for heavy rain. The car that was supposed to make Leyland a genuine fourth force in Australian motoring hemorrhaged $50 million and folded the operation. The factory workers threw a celebration when production stopped. The P76 set out to transform the industry and ended up mourned only by those who hadn't built it. A disappointment so total it borders almost admirably on performance art. 15 cars where expectation walked confidently into the room and reality followed it quietly out the back door. From the Chrysler by Chrysler's confused identity to the Camira's spectacular quality collapse, from the AU Falcon's $600 million styling lesson to the P76's journey from car of the year to factory closure party. Australian automotive history is full of genuine brilliance. But these 15 prove that the distance between a great idea and a great car is where everything actually happens. Some of them came very close. Most of them made absolutely sure everyone knew about it. If you enjoyed watching this video, give it a like and subscribe if you want. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.